On a Monday morning in early January, 342 automotive plants scattered across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana received identical notifications. Critical component shipments from Canada were being delayed indefinitely, not canceled, not banned, just delayed. And within 72 hours, that single word transformed into a national crisis that nobody in Washington anticipated. 20,000 workers stood idle on factory floors. Assembly lines went silent. Billion-dollar contracts triggered penalty clauses, and suddenly, the fragility of the entire American manufacturing system became impossible to hide. Because when you've built your production model around just-in-time delivery with zero inventory buffers, a delay of 3 days might as well be a complete shutdown. You cannot build cars without parts, and when those parts are stuck somewhere between customs checkpoints and distribution centers, entire communities watch their paychecks evaporate in real time. Construction firms across the United States discovered that Canadian steel and lumber shipments were no longer clearing on the timelines their contracts assumed. Projects worth billions suddenly faced delays that triggered cascading failures across development portfolios. Energy markets reacted immediately, as traders realized guaranteed flows of Canadian oil and natural gas were no longer guaranteed at all. Prices spiked not because supply actually stopped, but because the assumption of reliability disappeared overnight. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated response to an ultimatum that crossed a line most Americans never knew existed. And the lesson it taught about where real power lives in the modern economy is one that Washington will spend years trying to forget. Before factories went dark, before workers went home, there was a meeting in Washington. Behind closed doors, Trump's administration presented Canadian officials with what they called a final demand. Canada must agree to restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies received preferential access at below-market prices. Think carefully about what that actually means. The United States government demanded that a sovereign nation sell its natural resources at a financial loss to satisfy a political narrative in Washington, not to address genuine shortages, not to stabilize markets during an emergency, but to force Canada to subsidize American industries by surrendering economic value that belonged to Canadian workers and Canadian shareholders. When Canadian officials examined that ultimatum, they understood immediately that compliance was not just economically damaging, it was existential. Agreeing to those terms would set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president decided pressure was politically useful. That was the line Ottawa refused to cross. And the refusal came not with threats or dramatic pronouncements, but with something far more devastating to the American industrial system. Canada quietly withdrew from voluntary supply chain coordination agreements that had kept North American manufacturing running smoothly for 70 years. No treaties were violated, no contracts were breached. But the intricate choreography that allowed components to flow seamlessly across the border, that enabled factories to operate without costly inventory warehouses, that made just-in-time manufacturing possible, simply stopped functioning, and within hours, the consequences began cascading through sectors that Washington had taken for granted. This is where the Trump administration's fundamental misunderstanding of modern economics became painfully clear. Size does not equal leverage in an integrated supply chain. The country that controls critical inputs at strategic choke points often holds far more practical power than the final market, regardless of GDP comparisons. And Canada sits at precisely those choke points. Energy, rare earth minerals, automotive components, construction materials, pharmaceuticals. These are not products American industries can easily replace. Not in weeks, not in months, and in some cases, not without massive capital investment that takes years to complete. The administration issued its ultimatum as if Canada had no choice but to fold, as if asymmetry of economic size alone guaranteed submission. But that assumption ignored a basic reality. Modern manufacturing is not about who has the biggest economy. It is about who controls the components that cannot be substituted when they disappear. A single missing part can idle an entire facility employing 5,000 workers. And when hundreds of facilities face that reality simultaneously, political rhetoric becomes irrelevant very quickly. For 4 decades, American corporations optimized relentlessly for efficiency. They eliminated inventory. They reduced buffers. They built supply chains so finely tuned that a single disruption anywhere in the system could paralyze operations everywhere else. It was celebrated as brilliant management, lean manufacturing, just-in-time delivery, maximum return on capital, until the moment when efficiency revealed itself as fragility, and 3 days of delay exposed what decades of optimization had actually created. A modern automobile crosses the Canadian-American border 7 times before final assembly. Steel milled in Hamilton becomes parts fabricated in Detroit, that become sub-assemblies shipped to Windsor, that return to Michigan for integration. Remove any single link in that chain and the entire system stops. Not slows down. Stops. Because there is no warehouse full of backup inventory. There is no alternative supplier ready to step in. There is only the assumption that tomorrow will function exactly like today, and when that assumption breaks, everything breaks with it. Canadian steel, Canadian lumber, Canadian energy. For decades, these flowed across the border so reliably that American industries stopped thinking about them as foreign inputs. They were simply there, always available, always on time, until suddenly they were not. And the industries that had built their entire operational models around that reliability discovered they had no plan B, no alternative sources that could scale up quickly, no inventory buffers to buy time while they figured it out, just empty assembly lines and workers sent home without pay. The phone calls started within 24 hours, not from political operatives or lobbyists, but from CEOs and plant managers. They were not calling to debate ideology or discuss negotiating strategy. They were calling to explain operational facts. Factories would shut down within days. Workers would be furloughed by the tens of thousands. And competitors in Europe and Asia, who were not dealing with this self-inflicted chaos, would permanently capture market share that American companies would never recover. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements. Manufacturing associations released projections showing 340,000 jobs at immediate risk. Industry coalitions that typically avoid direct political confrontation began publicly demanding that the administration reverse course before irreversible damage occurred. Labor unions warned of imminent mass layoffs. Republican senators from affected states broke ranks to demand immediate resolution, and suddenly, the coalition that had supported Trump's aggressive trade posture began fracturing under the weight of consequences that could no longer be hidden or explained away. Because this was different from previous trade confrontations, the tariffs on China could be spun as tough negotiation. The threats against Mexico could be walked back at the last minute. But Canada was fundamentally different. The level of economic integration was deeper. The reliance was more absolute. And the political will to submit simply did not exist in Ottawa. That combination created a crisis that could not be managed with bluster or last-minute deal-making. Trump now faced a trap entirely of his own making. 2 options. Both failures. He could escalate, impose the comprehensive tariffs he had threatened, and watch as factories that were already teetering shut their doors entirely, as layoffs spread from the industrial Midwest into energy sectors and construction industries, as consumer prices rose across multiple categories, as the narrative that this was all temporary negotiating tactics collapsed under the weight of lived economic experience. Because Americans notice when factories close, when construction projects stall, when their cost of living rises month after month. Those are not abstract metrics that can be explained away. Those are kitchen table realities that destroy political support. Or he could retreat, quietly walk back the ultimatum, negotiate some face-saving compromise, and face a different kind of reckoning. His entire political identity was built on the idea that he never backed down, that threats always produced submission, that American power was absolute. Any visible concession to Canada would be framed by critics and eventually by his own supporters, as proof that the strongman posture failed when confronted with a sovereign nation willing to absorb short-term pain to protect long-term independence. This is the cost of treating trade policy as performance art, of prioritizing narrative over substance, of issuing ultimatums without exit strategies. Because dominance that produces economic collapse is not strength, it is failure. And once that failure becomes visible, once workers are sent home and prices spike and factories go dark, no amount of political spin can change the reality on the ground. But the damage extends far beyond this immediate crisis. Because allies around the world are watching, they are not evaluating this situation based on White House press briefings or campaign rally rhetoric. They are watching outcomes. They are observing whether the United States can sustain integrated partnerships without weaponizing them, whether American leadership understands the difference between leverage and self-harm, and the conclusions they are drawing will shape diplomatic and economic strategies for years to come. Economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that cannot be managed through normal diplomatic channels. And once that lesson is learned by governments and corporations globally, it does not unlearn itself. Companies begin adjusting supply chain strategies. Governments start diversifying trade relationships. Investment flows shift toward jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists, and the world quietly begins building economic systems that do not depend on American reliability. Canada is not waiting for Washington to resolve its internal contradictions. Canadian officials are actively accelerating efforts to diversify trade relationships, deepening economic ties with Europe and Asia, ensuring that no future American ultimatum can carry the same systemic threat, because the lesson learned here is brutally practical. Dependence on a partner who treats interdependence as a weapon rather than mutual benefit is itself a fundamental vulnerability that must be systematically reduced. American companies are already redesigning their supply chains, sourcing components from alternative suppliers even at significantly higher cost, building redundancy and inventory buffers instead of pursuing maximum efficiency, shifting long-term investment toward jurisdictions where policy remains predictable, and once those corporate decisions are made, they rarely reverse. The integrated North American economy that took generations to build begins to fragment, not with dramatic announcements or headlines, but with thousands of quiet recalculations made in boardrooms across the country. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. The supply chains did not break because of natural disaster or unavoidable crisis. They broke because political theater was elevated above institutional stewardship, because complexity was treated as weakness, because dominance was pursued without regard for the integrated systems that actually sustain American prosperity and security. The people paying the price are not the architects of this policy. They are workers sent home from idle plants, small business owners unable to get construction materials, families facing higher energy costs through no fault of their own, communities watching decades of economic integration unravel while those responsible remain completely insulated from immediate consequences. And that disconnect between decision makers and those who bear the cost is precisely what makes this crisis so corrosive. When trust is replaced with contingency planning, when reliability becomes conditional, the old integrated system never quite comes back the same way. And when the world's largest economy demonstrates that it will weaponize economic interdependence for short-term political theater, the world learns to protect itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but systematically and permanently. 3 days was all it took to expose a truth that decades of integration had obscured. Power without reliability is not power at all. It is just noise. And in the end, the noise fades, but the consequences remain.